We're looking at what it means to have a changed heart, of what it means to not follow this rigid list of rules written on external stone in the Old Testament on these tablets, and a changed, transformed heart that Jesus has for us. He wants to change a heart, to give us a new heart from Ezekiel 36 and do new things in us. And that will empower us to follow him, to understand what he wants from us, and be able to do it. But sometimes we get in the way. Sometimes we cut some corners to make things seem better or adjust them for our personal gain. So I'm going to give you an example of that real quick. And I'm going to put some pictures on the screen. And the first one is, hold on, don't, not yet. Take it off. Okay, well, okay. All right, you saw it already. But if you know this first one, don't spoil it for anybody else, okay? All right? So let's put the first one on. So if you know who this person is, this is a famous person, okay? This is not some random person I came up with, trying to stump you. There's no tricks here. Does anybody know who this person is? All right, so it's the same person. Let's go to the next one. Does anybody know who this is? It's the same person. This picture was probably, between 1928 and 1932, if that helps you. Not that you were around then, but to give you some historical context. If you probably can't see it, but there's the word on the front of the jersey that says Purdue. That could be something that gives it away to anybody. And this person is in the basketball world, if that didn't get it. Anybody know who this is yet? Okay, you can shout it out if you know. All right, next picture. Anybody know who it is yet? This very famous person. Well, I don't know, for some people. All right, anybody? All right, last picture. See if anybody can get this yet. John Wooden. Okay, we got it. This is John Wooden. All right, so John Wooden, he won the Indiana State Basketball Championship in 1927. He was a three-time All-American at Purdue. As a coach, he won 10 national basketball, won the tournament 10 times, National Collegiate Athletic Conference. Sorry, I couldn't get it, NCAA. But had 4 perfect seasons. And this is something I've never told most people. There may be a few of you in here that know this. My grandpa was John Wooden's high school basketball coach. Isn't that really cool? Yeah. So that's really cool. But here's the thing. Let me read you the newspaper clip that I can prove shows that my grandpa was John Wooden's basketball coach. And this is legitimate. So he was from Martinsville, Indiana, and if that matters. So this is on March 20th, 1927, right after they won the state championship. So coached by Glenn Curtis, cousin of Curtis Alexander. Curtis Alexander is my grandpa. So coached by Glenn Curtis, cousin of Curtis Alexander of Potomac, Illinois, who sat on the Martinsville bench and aided his relative throughout the 2-day session. Anybody catch what I did there? And I said my grandpa coached John Wooden in high school. He got to sit on the bench for 2 games during John Wooden's high school basketball career. So in all reality, it was my grandpa's cousin. So that is my first cousin twice removed was John Wooden's high school basketball coach. Can anybody name their first cousin twice removed? It is either your cousin's grandchild or your grandparent's cousin. You might be able to name your cousin's grandchild. That's something some people might be able to do. Can anybody do it? Can anybody name a second? Yeah, okay. I think I saw 4 hands up there. All right, so I can only name one of them because of this particular story. So my grandpa was a high school basketball coach, and his cousin invited him to sit on the bench for 2 games during John Wooden's high school career, so I can say my grandpa helped coach John Wooden in high school. And John Wooden is revered and most commonly as the greatest college basketball coach of all time. And say my grandpa helped shape that person. That's what we tend to do when we talk about this 9th commandment of lying. We do things like we fabricate, or we only provide enough details as to not lie, but give people the impression of certain things. So exaggeration or fabrication are certain things we do, but we also sometimes omit details, and as such are deceptive. So you guys applauded when I said my grandpa was John Wynn's high school basketball coach. You're not going to applaud if I say that again now. And you understood what I was doing. I hope it was all fun and games with that. But a mission sometimes to make us look better, which sometimes to receive accolades or appreciation. Other time is to avoid punishment. It's for self-protection. And sometimes I don't know if we necessarily would classify this as a lie, but when we interact with someone, when we greet them, we say, "How are you doing?" That is a common thing we do. And almost always we say, "Okay," or "I'm doing all right." And not that we have to unload every time that somebody asks us that question, because that's part of our culture. Our greeting is, "How are you doing?" It's not just "hi." It's we ask this question. And so, but we tend to make it look like we're okay, and we don't tell the full story. But we have other types of lies, of plagiarism or broken promises that you don't intend to keep in the first place. There's all sorts of ways that we can lie. And so we come to the 9th commandment in Exodus chapter 20, verse 16, and it says, "You must not testify falsely against your neighbor." You must not lie. But testify falsely against your neighbor is a specific direction that the commandment goes. So this concept of testify means making a claim. So don't make a false claim against your neighbor. Don't say something against somebody else that is false or untrue or seeks to harm them without being accurate. And so I think it's important for us to be wise with our language. There's a quote from John Wesley that I love that says, "Of those dead or absent, nothing but good." Right? If someone has passed away, why speak poorly of them? Right? There's no benefit to that. And if someone is not present, in most cases, speaking negatively about them is often non-Jesus. Now, we can have hard conversations. There's appropriate times to have hard conversations. And I'm not trying to ignore that we have to have rose-colored glasses on, that we have to pretend everything is perfect when it's not. But what would it look like for us to talk this way? Now, if we look at the 10 Commandments as a whole, we can see how certain ones are connected to others in different ways. This commandment, Commandment 9, is about how you speak about other people. Commandment 3 was you must not take the Lord's name in vain. So Commandment 3 is how you speak about the Lord our God. And so we see these shifts and how they're connected. It's not only important that we talk about God appropriately, but we also have to talk about each other with respect and reverence and good attitudes. Now, we have this concept of neighbor. And when we look at the Old Testament, and particularly in Exodus, what was happening here, is that the Old Testament, we have this community, the Israelites, the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, this nation that they eventually form, that they are a community. And so this is talking about how do they function in a community. So the concept of neighbor is within the fellow Israelites, but it's not limited to that. But one of the things that's at play here is the legal system in the ancient world. And we see time and time again how things are very countercultural. Now, we talk about Jesus was countercultural, and we say, oh, yeah, the Old Testament was very countercultural, and it was setting standards that most of the other world didn't have yet at this point. Because at this time in history, when Moses and the Israelites are receiving the 10 Commandments, most people did not have protection from a legal standpoint. In fact, there were a lot of societies in which you were presumed guilty until proven innocent. So there weren't a lot of standards, there weren't a lot of protection, there weren't a lot of safeguards, and sometimes the accused person didn't even get to mount a defense if they were accused. So if you were a poor person or just a regular person who wasn't super wealthy, You had limited things at your disposal in order to protect yourselves if you were accused against something else. So a lot of these accusations were my word against your word, or he said, she said, those types of things. And many offenses in the ancient world were treated as capital offenses. So there was a lot at stake here. This wasn't a slap on the wrist deal. This was literally a life or death situation. So Commandment 9, on some ways, preserves the integrity of judgment in the legal system. Now, I've never met anybody who just would have a blanket statement that they would say, lying is good, or no lying is bad. Most people say you shouldn't lie, but yet we struggle with lying. And one of the ways I think that lying can creep into our lives is through the act of complaining. Because usually when we complain, we start real slow, but we can gain some real awesome momentum when we start complaining, right? Right? It starts to, I can't believe my boss did this. And then all of a sudden we talk about all the terrible attributes of the boss or whoever it may be, and we get more and more and more momentum. And when we get in a group of people, man, complaints we try to one-up each other with our complaints. And so part of the lying with complaining is we misrepresent other people. Now, if you're venting, the point of venting is not so you just have an accurate statement. I recognize there is health involved in venting and be able to express how you feel. I'm not trying to speak against that at all. But oftentimes when we get into a larger session and complaining happens, we get to really skew the perspective of reality. And so maybe we cross the line into slander. Now, nobody wants to be slanderous. You don't want to be labeled as somebody who slanders other people because we know slander can be very detrimental. Somebody referred to as murder of the tongue or murder with the tongue. And it's never beneficial. It's never helpful. And we get sick and tired of it when we see our political candidates slandering each other, and it just is depressing and discouraging for us as regular individuals. Now, one of the things that's interesting is kind of comparing the Exodus passage, which is what we looked at, and this is where we traditionally find the Ten Commandments, but the Ten Commandments are also listed in Deuteronomy chapter 5. And there's different connotations that we see through Exodus and throughout the whole book of Deuteronomy. And Exodus is more of a literal interpretation of its meaning of saying things that are lies or untrue, while Deuteronomy has areas where it talks more about more than just the literal lie, but saying things that are insincere or empty or frivolous, that don't speak insincerely about others. That's a little different than by a blatant, bold-faced lie. See, I spoke insincerely about my grandpa as John Wooden's basketball coach, but it was not a blatant lie. It was insincere. And so our understanding of what does it mean to follow the ninth commandment is make sure we speak with sincerity. See, Jesus cares how we talk. He cares how we represent ourselves. He cares how we represent him. But as I think about this, I come to the conclusion that truthfulness needs no protection. If we stand on the truth, we don't need to be protected by it. You see, our purpose as followers of Jesus is not to meet the expectations of others, it's to honor Jesus in everything that we do. Because sometimes we say, well, I'm standing on the truth, but I don't want to offend people. Now, the purpose is not to offend people. If we're standing on the truth with the intent to offend somebody, we're no longer standing on the truth. In fact, sometimes we hide behind truth and disregard how other people feel about it. Just because we're standing on the truth doesn't mean we spew truth at other people to make them feel bad about themselves. See, we're honoring Jesus. And this concept of neighbor, Israelites lived in a community that it was a community, a nation of descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But neighbor is not limited just to those individuals. It's not just somebody you agree with. It's not somebody who is in close proximity to where your house is located. It's not somebody who is religiously affiliated with you. It's not somebody who is just a friend. It's more than that. See, Leviticus 19:18, it does tell us, it says, do not seek revenge or bear a grudge against a fellow Israelite, but love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord. All right, so it's talking about Israelites, and the Old Testament gives us explanation and commandments for how Israel is to function as community. But then we get to Luke chapter 10, and Jesus is asked the question, who is my neighbor? And so he tells this parable called the parable of the Good Samaritan. And essentially, your neighbor is anybody you encounter, anybody that you can have influence over, anybody that you can interact with. That person is your neighbor, and so we are not to seek revenge or hold a grudge against anybody we can encounter. See, a blatant failure to uphold Commandment 9 would be telling a lie that would harm somebody else. But it's more than just telling a blatant lie. It's about making sure we use our lives, our language, our attitudes, our mentalities, our actions in ways that honor God and honor other people. Because God has given us the capacity to speak, and he gives us responsibility with that capacity. We can use our words either to build people up or tear them down. We can do either or with that. And we know the concept that once we say something, it can no longer be taken back. Once it's put out there, we can apologize for it. We can say, that's not exactly what I meant. We can try to clarify, but once we've said it, we can't get it back. And there are all sorts of things that we can get back. You know, a lot of companies have recalls on all sorts of products, and they can either fix the product, replace the product, give you a refund, and that's how our society functions. But when we talk about words, we can never get them back. Once they're out there, they've done damage that sometimes we can't repair. We can try to fix, we can try to amend, but that damage is there. So as followers of Jesus, it's important, wise, prudent of us to treat lies as sin, because it is. When we lie, when we misrepresent the truth, when we speak insincerely or frivolously, we are not following Jesus. If you lie, we need to confess that. And I love the concept of the scope of your confession should equal the scope of your transgression. So if you sin, the impact that has on others, you need to have, your confession needs to be the same size. So if you hurt one person and it's contained in that, you confess to that person. If you hurt 10 people, your confession needs to be to 10 people. And so this is really hard because we don't like to admit we're wrong. But on the same hand, when we are wrong, we want to just go confess to Jesus, have this private matter, not talk to anybody else about it. We don't want to confess to others. We don't want other people to know we didn't follow Jesus properly. We don't like that. We want to make it look like we have it all figured out. We want to make sure that we look good. But one of the main traps I think that we can fall into is this word called gossip. Gossip is this nasty word. And everybody says we shouldn't gossip. Everybody is in agreement that this is not healthy or beneficial. But man, it's so hard to avoid. It's hard not to fall into this trap. Now, gossip is more than casual talk about somebody else. Now, and if we follow John Wesley's, of those dead or absent, nothing but good, then we wouldn't actually fall into the trap of gossip. Right? See, gossip is not building somebody up privately or like with others. Like if I speak nice about somebody to somebody else, that's not gossip. That's a compliment. That's helpful. That's beneficial. That builds people up. This is about sometimes damaging another person's reputation. But yet, one of our favorite ways to gossip is through prayer requests. We've all been there. We've always, oh man, there's a lot of details shared with that one that didn't need to be shared. And sometimes we can share prayer requests. If there's something going on, we can share, this person is struggling. And we can stop there. But we don't need to go on a 10-minute detailed itemization of the ways they are struggling to make them look like a terrible person. Now, I don't think we actually go into this trying to make somebody else look bad, or we don't consciously do that. But that is our tendency. And gossip hurts three people. It hurts the person sharing it, the person hearing it, and the person to whom it is about. It hurts all of those, and it could be multiple people, obviously, in any of those. But the fact of the matter, it hurts all three of those groups of individuals. At a minimum, when gossip happens, our responsibility is to leave it, to avoid it, to say, I'm not going to be a part of this. But one of my hesitancies with that is that's a very passive approach to sin. And in most cases with sin is not going to stop if we're passive with it. Sin is not going to stop just because we avoid it. Sin is going to continue until we identify it, call it out in the name of Jesus, and say, this is not Jesus. So this is where I get back to part of what the commandment is saying. We need to be people who speak truth. And sometimes we say, well, I don't want to offend people. Sometimes we have to offend people with the truth. Now that can be very uncomfortable. And sometimes it can damage relationships. But are we trying to preserve relationships, or are we trying to preserve the message of Jesus Christ? What are we fighting for here? Because if my relationship about Jesus has to be compromised to preserve a relationship from a human standpoint, then I'm not sure my relationship with Jesus is where it needs to be. What does that look like for us? Now, I'm not saying we need to be on a crusade, right? We're not out here kicking down doors, planting bugs in people's homes to try to catch them in gossip. The point is not to be a crazy person about this. The record is we can't stand for sin. We've got to be people who use our language in ways that honor Jesus and builds people up in the name of Jesus. That's who we have to be. Because otherwise, destruction reigns. Now, Jesus talks about our language, and we looked at this with a different commandment. He does this, though, in Matthew chapter 5. We're in the Sermon on the Mount here in Matthew 5, 7, and 8, or 5, 6, and 7, or Sermon on the Mount, where it's Jesus' longest discourse. And he says in verse 33, he says, you've heard it said, you must not break your vows. You must keep the vows you make to the Lord. But I say to you, this is what he does a lot, and particularly Matthew 5, this is what you've heard, but this is further instruction. This is deeper understanding. He says, but I say to you, you must not make any vows. Do not make vows by heaven, for heaven is God's throne. Do not say by earth, for the earth is God's footstool. Do not say by Jerusalem, for Jerusalem is the city of the great King. Do not even say by my head, for you can't turn even one hair on your head white or black. Just say a simple yes, I will, or no, I won't. Anything more comes from the evil one. Now, all cultures, traditions, have nuances and expectations for how we interact with each other. There's loopholes, and you do this in this situation, or you don't do this in this situation. And when you grew up in a culture, you just learn those types of things. If you move to a different culture or different country, you have to learn all these idioms and idiosyncrasies about that particular culture. But Commandment 9, you must not testify falsely against your neighbor, you must not lie, comes from the God who is the God of truth. That's one thing we learn about God when we look at this particular commandment. He is the God of truth. He does not lie. He does not speak falsely. There is nothing false about him. In 1 Samuel chapter 15, beginning verse 29 says, he who is the glory of Israel will not lie. Talking about God. God will not lie. So we come back to that fact that truthfulness needs no protection. God doesn't need to be protected because he shares the truth. When we share the truth, we don't have to be protected. Now, we don't have to be foolish about it either. You know, there's if a police officer pulls you over, a common thing they may say, the first thing is, do you know why I pulled you over? If you say no, most of the time you're lying. Let's be honest. Now, that doesn't mean you have to say, yeah, I was going 17 miles over the speed limit. Because for all you know, they pulled you over because you had a taillight out and they wanted to make sure you knew about it. So you could say, I think I do, but I prefer not to self-incriminate myself. Right? But now this is trivial. But if we don't think through these small areas, the big areas are going to be highly compromised in our lives. So what does it look like for us to be people of truth, who speak the truth, who follow this God who is the God of truth? So Jesus tells us not to make vows. Now, the context in which Jesus is specifically speaking is that they would add extra words to their vows to try to convince the other person that they were going to do what they said they were going to do, but they actually were saying it in a way that would give them an out so they wouldn't actually have to fulfill their obligation. They were trying to be manipulative. That's not what Jesus calls us to do. He doesn't call us to use our language manipulatively. So when I talk about my grandpa as John Wooden's high school basketball coach, that's manipulation. That's what it is. It's adjusting the fact to make myself look better than I really am. That's what we do. So how do we be people who are people of truth? Well, we have to ask ourselves the question of what lies am I telling? What lies am I telling myself? What lies am I telling others? Because we're usually not super honest with ourselves. We usually like to think that we're doing better than we think we are, and we give ourselves more grace, and we don't give other people the same grace that we give ourselves. So what lies are we allowing to creep into our lives? One of the most extreme examples we find in Scripture of people getting caught in a lie comes from Acts chapter 5. The story of Ananias and Sapphira. Ananias and Sapphira, husband and wife, they sold a field, and they were giving the money to the church, and Ananias gave the money to the church, and he held money back, and the text tells us very clearly that Sapphira knew about it. So he goes, he gives the money, and Peter was like, oh, was this the wholesale of the field? Kind of like nonchalantly asking the question. And Ananias very confidently said, yes, it is. Uh-oh. You know what happened next to the story? He was struck dead because he lied to the Spirit. And so the people carried him off. Weird, awkward, emotional moment. They carry him off. And a little later, Sapphira comes on the scene and has the same interaction with Peter. And Peter says, was this the full money of the field, price that you got for the sale of the field? And she said, yes. Uh-oh. She lied. She was struck dead because she lied to the Spirit. That's pretty dangerous stuff. Now, we don't want to be people that live in fear. Now, that's not the point of Acts 5. That's not a point of Commandment number 9. It's not a point of what Jesus is telling us in Matthew chapter 5. We don't want to be people that are just driven by fear, but what would happen if we took the commandments of God so seriously that it would impact everything we do? That we wouldn't be people who lie. We wouldn't be people of deception. We wouldn't be people who use wordplay to help us make ourselves look better. See, truth will spring from a pure heart. If we have a pure heart seeking Jesus, we're going to be open, honest, vulnerable, truthful people. But falsehood and deceit come from a corrupt heart. It comes from selfishness. It comes from pride. It comes from arrogance. Those types of things is where deceit comes into our lives. So Jesus tells us to speak clearly. He tells us to speak without pretense and no ulterior motive. Say, let your yes be yes, your no be no. Anything more from that is not from Jesus. Now, we sign contracts We live in the world where we have to have protection, and we have to learn how to function in the world while still staying true to Jesus. See, when we make an agreement in the world, we sign the paper, but Jesus says, my commitment to Jesus is more important than the thing I sign for somebody else. Or it better be. Am I really following Jesus if it's not? So what does it mean to tell the truth? What does it mean to be people who speak clearly? It means people living with integrity. It means we are honest. It doesn't mean that we're necessarily mean, because we know speaking the truth can tear people down if done improperly. So what is truth? Now, I think we have to pair truth with the fruit of the Spirit's love, agape, this New Testament word for love, of unconquerable benevolence for somebody else. If I speak the truth in love, which we command in Scripture to do, we have to make sure our first and foremost priority is to want the best for the other person. If I want the best for you, I can speak the truth in love to you. Now, that doesn't always mean I'm right. Now, so we have to have humility with that. Sometimes we can speak the truth in love, and we fumble it, and we mess up, and we have to own that. But if we do so with no ulterior motive, if we do so with only the best motives for the other person in our heart, then I think the relationship can still thrive, even if we make a mistake. See, speaking the truth is not about being critical. It's not about being suspicious. It's not about defending others. It can have those things. It's not also about excusing behavior. It's not just about kindness and roses. It's not about just the extremes. It's about all of it. Sometimes speaking the truth in love has critical nature. It can be rebuke. Sometimes speaking the truth in love is all grace and mercy and kindness, because that's who God is. We have both of these that come to play. But we can't just rely on one or the other. We've got to ask Jesus, what does it mean for me to speak truth and love in this situation or that situation? But another area of lies that we tend to creep into our lives are these things called little white lies. And sometimes we tell these to our kids to protect them from kind of the difficult areas in this world that they may not be ready for yet. Sometimes we tell them to our kids so that they have an increased sense of imagination when it comes to particular holidays or something like that. And I'm not trying to condemn us for those types of things. That's not my point here today. My point is to challenge you to make sure we recognize what are the areas we allow things that aren't necessarily truthful into our lives, and does this honor Jesus? I don't think there's any harm in me talking about my grandpa's John Wooden's basketball coach. Now, if I went around bragging about that, it would be weird, first off. But it would be unhealthy. If we allow those things to creep into our lives, it would be unhealthy. If we allow non-truth to creep into our lives, it's unhealthy from a Jesus standpoint. The Exodus is about lies, it's about the more explicit, while Deuteronomy has the connotation of insincerity and frivolous. Is that how your language works? You sometimes cut corners to make yourself look better. You sometimes say things that aren't full truth, but because you don't want to deal with whatever situation it may be, you want to protect yourself. And the point is not to be self-incriminating. The point is saying, how can I be a person who stands on the truth of Jesus? How can I be a person that lives with authenticity with Jesus? How can I be a person that even though it's not always easy, I make sacrifices so I can say, I follow Jesus above the rules of this world. Now, here's the reality. Sometimes we do a really good job at this. Sometimes we don't. And if you don't, the point of what I'm saying today is not to make yourself feel bad about yourself. But what I want to challenge you today, regardless of where you are, is to hold on to Jesus. hold on to his truth. Because if we hold on to Jesus, the truth of Jesus is going to rub off in our lives. The truth of Jesus is going to infiltrate all that we are. So if you're struggling with this today, or struggling with whatever it may be, I want to challenge you, hold on. Allow a little bit more Jesus into your life. And see how that will shape you, how that will change you, how that will transform you, your situations, your relationships, whatever it may be. Jesus will do that work in your life. So just hold on.